The King's Indian defense is known for its dynamic potential and rich opportunities for bold attacks and sacrifices. In today's video, we examine a groundbreaking game that played a very important role in the development of this opening and gave birth to the Mar del Plata variation. In this historical encounter, Svetozar Gligoric achieved ideal harmony by improving the position of all his pieces, enabling them to contribute to both attack and defense. After that, he launched a devastating attack and checkmated his opponent. Gligoric's opponent, Miguel Najdorf, starts with d4. Gligoric plays his favorite King's Indian defense, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. And Najdorf opts for the classical system. Knight f3, short castle, and bishop e2. Gligoric immediately attacks the d4 pawn, Najdorf castles, and in this position the common move before this game used to be knight d7. However, a new move had just been discovered. Instead of knight d7, black develops the knight more actively, knight c6, putting more pressure on the d4 pawn, but letting white cross the center of the board with a tempo, attacking the knight. The knight must retreat, and now that the center is closed, the plans of the sides are obvious. White has the space advantage on the queen side, so he's going to push his pawns on this side of the board, preparing the advance of the c-pawn, after which white usually captures on d6, opening the c-file. White major pieces occupy this open file. The knight might jump to b5, attacking the weak d6 pawn and targeting the c7 square. And the knight might invade this square with a tempo, attacking the rook, and all this might be quite unpleasant. While black, in his turn, is going to attack on the king side. He's going to move away the knight from f6, unblocking the f-pawn, and the pawn will move forward to f5, followed by f4, after which black will push the g-pawn and try to initiate a very strong attack on the white king. In this position, white has different options. Immediate b4 is possible, or white can try bishop d2 or knight d2. In our game, white opted for knight e1, which is also one of the common lines. The idea is, by moving the knight from f3, to unblock the f-pawn, because black is going to push his f-pawn, after which from f5 the pawn will attack the e4 pawn, or the pawn from f5 might move forward to f4. And after the g-pawn moves forward, the pawn from f4 might even move to f3, so destroying white's king side. For this reason, by moving away the knight from f3, white prepares f3, which will solve all these problems. So on f3, the white pawn will defend, will reinforce the e4 pawn and also blockade the black f-pawn once it reaches the f4 square. Besides that, by moving away the knight from f3, white has opened the bishop's diagonal, and now it controls the h5 square. That means the knight from f6 cannot jump to h5, which black usually does in the King's Indian defense. For this reason, as knight h5 doesn't work, black plays knight d7. And from d7, the knight also controls the c5 square, preventing the immediate advance of the white c-pawn. Najdorf plays knight d3, taking under control the c5 square and preparing the advance of the c-pawn. Gligoric immediately starts his pawn storm. f5. Now, besides f4, black might even capture on e4. For example, in case white makes a random developing move, bishop d2, black can capture on e4, after which, of course, white will get a great blockading square for his knight on e4. However, in return, black will get an opportunity to reroute his passive knight via f5 to a great central d4 square. For this reason, after f5, white reinforces his e4 pawn and also blockades the black's pawn, because the pawn will move to f4. Of course, now it doesn't make sense for black to capture on e4, because white would simply capture with the pawn, taking under control the f5 square, preventing the black knight from jumping to f5, followed by knight d4, so the knight will remain passive on e7 and black wouldn't have any pawn storm on the king side. In this position, white has a positional advantage. So, of course, instead of capturing on e4, Gligoric pushes the pawn forward to f4. And as you see now, the f-pawn blockades black's f-pawn, and the only thing black can do is to push the g-pawn forward. Najdorf plays bishop d2, developing his bishop and vacating the c1 square for the rook. And in this position, the common setup for black used to be rook f6, followed by g5 and rook g6. And from g6, the rook supports the further advance of the g-pawn. However, as Gligoric writes in his annotations, he disliked the disharmony of this maneuver, of this rook maneuver, because on g6 the rook would occupy this square, preventing the black knight, the e7 knight, from jumping on this square. And this knight will be passive, and black usually has problems in activating this bad piece. Instead of rook f6 for this game, Gligoric prepared a new setup. First, he plays knight f6 instead of rook f6. From f6, the knight controls the g4 square and supports the advance of the g-pawn. Najdorf plays in the most logical way, of course. He needs to prepare to carry out the advance of his c-pawn, so he prepares it by playing b4. Gligoric plays g5, c5. Now, of course, black cannot play g4 because white controls this square 3 times with the pawn, the bishop and the queen, while black controls it only twice with the knight and the bishop. So Gligoric plays h5, taking under control this square one more time, and now black is ready to push the g-pawn forward. For this reason, Najdorf prevents it by playing knight f2, taking under control this square one more time. And Gligoric, now that his rook isn't on g6, now that the g6 square is vacated, he plays knight g6. At the moment it isn't clear what the knight is doing on g6, but very soon you will see Gligoric's idea. White keeps playing in the most logical way, rook c1, and we have reached the critical position. It seems that black's position is critical, because black's position is cramped, black pieces are passive, the rook on the f-file isn't doing anything because this file is closed. The bishop is also bad because it's restricted by its own pawn. It isn't clear what the knight is doing on g6. Black cannot play g4, and that's the only way for black to initiate an attack on the white king, because white has prevented this advance, while white is ready to capture on d6, and after c takes d, the c file would be open. The white rook is already on the c file, and white will play knight b5, attacking the weak d6 pawn and also targeting the c7 square, and white will be ready to invade, which will be very unpleasant. Attacking the rook, and after the rook moves, the knight from c7 will jump to e6, and that will be really annoying for black. And it isn't clear how black can prevent all this, because black pieces aren't taking part in the defense of all these weaknesses of c7, of d6. Neither can black pieces take part in the attack. However, Gligoric prepared a very original setup. Now he will rearrange his pieces, and he will rearrange them in the most harmonious way. After this rearrangement, the pieces will be placed in the most harmonious way, taking part in both the defense of the 7th rank, the 8th rank, and the d6 pawn, and also in the attack. These pieces, namely the rook, the bishop, and the knight, which are at the moment terribly placed, will also support the advance of the g-pawn. Now you can pause the video and try to find Gligoric's setup, which gave birth to this variation. After that, this variation is known as Mar del Plata variation. So Gligoric first plays rook f7. On f7, the rook defends the 7th rank. Now white won't be able to invade this square. Besides that, the rook will also take part in the attack, because black is going to play bishop f8, after which the rook will replace the bishop on g7, and from g7 the rook will support the advance of the g-pawn. On f8, the bishop will, in his turn, defend the weakness on d6 and also close the 8th rank. So in case white major pieces invade the 8th rank, the black king will be absolutely safe. And what about the knight? The knight will be rerouted via h8, f7 to h6. And from h6 it will also support the g4 advance and the perfect harmony will be achieved. Najdorf exchanges on d6 and after c takes d, he continues his pawn storm on the queen side. a4. Of course, bishop f8 followed. a5 and rook g7. Now that the rook is on the g file, black might think about immediate g4. That's why Najdorf prevents it by playing h3, taking again one more time under control the g4 square. And now knight h8, opening the rook's line. Now the rook supports the advance of the g-pawn, and the knight of course will be rerouted to h6, after which black will be ready to play g4. Or black can even play g4 immediately, sacrificing a pawn, and only then reroute the knight to h6 and capture the pawn on g4 anyways. And Najdorf makes a standard move, knight b5. However, now that the rook is on the 7th rank, it controls the c7 square, so the knight cannot invade. Neither can the knight create any threats to the d6 pawn, because it is also defended by the bishop. So Gligoric simply ignores knight b5 and continues his pawn storm. g4. White exchanges on g4. After h takes g, h takes g. Currently white is up a pawn, but of course this pawn is weak and it will fall. Of course, black cannot capture right away, because white defends this pawn 3 times and black is attacking it also 3 times. So first Gligoric must reroute his knight to h6 and then capture on g4. However, in case he plays in a straightforward way, knight f7 immediately, then the knight on f7 would close the rook's line, and the rook would stop defending the c7 square, and the white knight would invade with a tempo, attacking the rook, and after the rook moves, the knight invades e6 with great effect. Of course, black cannot tolerate this knight, and he must exchange his light-squared bishop for this knight. But light-squared bishop plays a very important role in the attack on the white king, in the king's Indian defense. But black must agree to the exchange of this valuable piece, after which black's attack, of course, would lose its energy, and white would also get a very annoying pawn on e6. For this reason, before playing knight f7, Gligoric kicks the knight out of b5 so that it cannot invade c7. He plays a6. However, by playing a6, Gligoric creates a new weakness in his position, the b6 square. That's why Najdorf plays knight a3. He's going to reroute the knight via c4 to b6 with the fork, attacking the rook and again the valuable bishop, and the bishop would be exchanged. For example, again, if black plays knight f7 in the most straightforward way, after knight c4, knight h6, of course black will capture the pawn, but after knight b6 and the rook is under attack, and after the rook moves, white would eliminate this valuable bishop, after which black's chances on the king side would decrease. For this reason, it's important to retain this bishop. So Gligoric isn't in a hurry to capture, to get back the pawn. So first he saves his bishop. Bishop d7, knight c4, again white is ready to play knight b6, again with a fork, but rook c8. And after knight b6, first Gligoric exchanges the rooks with a tempo. White must capture the rook, and then he retains his bishop, bishop e8. And you will see the power of this bishop. You will see what an important role this bishop will play in the attack on the white king. White plays bishop a3, hoping to push the b-pawn forward, after which the bishop's diagonal would open, and also vacating the c1 square for the major pieces. And now, finally, knight f7 followed. Queen c2, creating some pressure on the c-file. That's white's only chance for the counterplay, the invasion on the c file, and Gligoric plays knight h6, of course. Now this pawn is doomed. In case white invades by playing queen c8, Gligoric writes that after the exchange of the queens, black's position would be better in view of the weakness of the e4 pawn and g2 pawn. Indeed, white is ready to play b5, for example, opening the bishop's diagonal, after which the d6 pawn would fall, but black can prevent it by playing bishop b5, blockading the b pawn, and after the exchange of the bishops, white's position is almost hopeless, because his pieces are very passively placed, while black is very strong. The e4 pawn is doomed, and white, of course, can capture the b5 pawn by playing knight a7. But after knight takes g4, knight takes g4, and rook takes g4, white can, of course, if white tries to defend the e4 pawn, black would immediately play f3. The rook must stay on the f file to control the f3 square. Otherwise, when it moves by playing f3, black would attack both the g2 pawn and also the e4 pawn for the second time. So white can capture on b5, and black will capture a much more important central pawn, after which black's position is almost winning, because he has a very strong pawn, the e5 pawn, the passed pawn, so the knight can move away from e4, after which the e pawn would move forward. Besides that, white pieces are terrible, the bishop is bad, the knight isn't doing anything on b5, the rook cannot leave the f file because of f3, black can play knight g3 with a tempo attacking the rook, followed by rook h4, creating some unpleasant threats. And also after knight g3, the e pawn would move forward. Black can also activate his bad light-squared bishop by rerouting it to h4, so white's position is lost in this case. For this reason, Najdorf doesn't invade c8 square. Instead, he, as the g pawn is doomed anyways, and black is going to capture it next move anyways, he plays g5, forcing black to capture it with the rook, at least, so that to deflect the rook from the 7th rank, and now the 7th rank isn't defended. Now Najdorf plays rook c1, putting more pressure on the c file, but rook g3 follows with a tempo, attacking the bishop. White must save the bishop, bishop b2, and now knight f knight moves to g4, opening the queen's diagonal. So in case white invades either to c7 or to c8, black can play queen h4 with terrible threats. The knight, together with the queen, will create terrible threats to the white king. So white cannot invade on the c file. That's why, as knight g4 also created a terrible threat of the invasion on e3, attacking both the queen and the g2 pawn. Also, black is threatening immediate rook takes g2, check, and after king takes g2, knight e3 with a fork, winning the queen. For this reason, white eliminates the knight. The second knight jumps on g4 with the same threats of rook takes g2 check, followed by knight e3 with a fork. That's why Najdorf exchanges his bishop for this knight. And rook takes g4. Now black is threatening f3, attacking the g2 pawn and capturing it next move, because the pawn is pinned. For this reason, queen f2, taking under control the f3 square. Now the weakness of this pawn will tell, and now you will see the power of the light-squared bishop. Now you will see why Gligoric retained this bishop. Bishop g6, attacking the pawn. Rook c4, defending the pawn, and queen e7. The queen is heading to h7, after which black will attack the pawn for the second time, and also after queen h7, rook h4 would follow, and black will create terrible threats on the open h file. White doesn't have any active plan, so he simply plays bishop c3, queen h7. Now the pawn is under attack, that's why queen e2, defending the pawn, and rook h4, threatening checkmate in 3. Rook h1 check, king f2, queen h4 check, king f3 or g3, doesn't matter, and queen queen g3 checkmate would follow. That's why the king tries to escape to the queen side, king f2. And another strong move by Gligoric, f3, removing the last defender of the king and opening the second rank. Of course, white cannot capture this pawn, neither with the g-pawn. In case white captures with the g-pawn, rook h2 check would follow and white would lose the queen, nor with the queen. If queen takes f3, then rook f4 would pin the queen. And the white queen is under attack. That's why white plays queen e3. Rook f4 followed, creating another threat. Queen h4 check, kicking out the king from f2, after which the f-pawn would move forward and promote to queen. That's why g takes f. But now the second rank is open and the queen invades. Queen h2 check. King e1 followed and queen h1 check, attacking the f3 pawn for the second time. That's why white must play king e2, defending the pawn. And one more time. The power of the light squared bishop tells. Bishop h5, attacking the pawn for the third time, and there is no way to save this pawn. That's why white tries to save his king. The king runs to the queen side, king d2. But black pieces develop the enormous activity and they will get the white king on the queen side. So first, Gligoric captures on f3 with a tempo attacking the queen, queen g5 check, bishop g7. And now black is threatening checkmate in 3 moves after rook f2 check. For example, in case white makes the obvious move rook c8 check, it turns out that after king h7, the black king is absolutely safe. And in case white tries to create a threat of checkmate on g7 by playing rook c7, the white king gets checkmated instead. After rook f2 check, king d3, queen f1 check, king e3, queen e2, checkmate. That's why after bishop g7, instead of rook c8 check, white continues the escape of his king to the queen side, king c2. Still, rook f2 check followed, bishop d2, queen d1 check, king c3, and queen a1 check. Now the white king has 3 squares, c2, b3, and d3. In case the king moves to b3, then bishop d1 check would follow, rook c2, which looks like the only move, queen b1 check. White is losing the rook and black is threatening checkmate, black is winning. In case the king moves to c2 instead, then bishop d1 check, king d3, queen b1 check, king e3, rook f3, checkmate. And finally, if the king moves to d3, then again bishop e2 check, king e3, rook f3 check, sacrificing the bishop, and after king takes e2, queen f1 checkmate. That means there is no way white can prevent the checkmate, so after queen a1 check, Najdorf resigned. And now I recommend watching how Bobby Fischer masterfully employed the king's Indian defense against Viktor Korchnoi. In this game, Fischer executed a brilliant knight maneuver and destroyed the enemy kingside. But first like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.